I appreciate you being on the show, Dr. Stanton Peele. How you been?
I've been good, Adam. It's always good to be on the air with you. I know you're one of the advanced thinkers in the field, so it's a pleasure for me.
Oh, I got all nostalgic now. When when a mentor of mine that I admire so much. Thank you so much
Well,
because
we had
they.
a very good conversation last time, Al, and you previewed some of the questions this time, and I'm looking forward to talking with you again.
Oh, I appreciate it. And well, what you've been a pioneer on the fight, as I like to call it, against chemical incarceration and other ideas long before cognitive rampage came around or said anything. So I appreciate you for one, as I said in the last one, as I'd say now, is being in the trenches and continuing the fight as well.
Well, I don't have to get ideas from other people. I like to think I've germinated an awful lot of the reform ideas in the field of addiction and drug policy.
Definitely in a forefront on the enforcer. So, but before we kind of walk in and get too heavily in the dialect of mental health and addiction, for some people, I also realized when I was practicing that a lot of people just don't understand what the routine is like what happens when, right? They watch shows like Intervention, etc. They think of rehab maybe the mostly. So maybe to help kind of walk through a typical person that starts experiencing addiction or the chemical incarceration idea of some kind of anything, what typical is that the treatment offered? What's the process like that's offered for the average individual, not the an average socioeconomic stand?
Well, I think the first thing I have to mention is that the vast majority of people don't undergo treatment for their addictions. Um, think about quitting smoking, and it's possibly not accurate to say virtually all, but the large majority overcome their addictions. So I don't know when you speak about chemical incarceration, I'm not sure what you mean, but drug policy reform says we think the problems of drug laws are worse than the problems of drugs. I think that the problems of drug treatment or requiring people to be in treatment are very often worse than the problem of the original addiction.
Yeah, that's kind of the forefront. So that typical treatment of addiction, right? A lot of people we assume just should know, and when it comes down to it, I have a lot of friends that have experienced that, and they reach out to me like, "What do we do?" Right? They're not even sure what to do to help out a family member or a child or even a parent or something.
Well, I mean, one thing I should put in here is a plug for I have an on air program called the Life Process Program, which I developed as an actual inpatient, a residential rehab. And now I have it offline, I have it online with counselors and coaches. Coaches that I've trained on my own. That's one form of help to seek. And seeking help is a good thing. Seeking help in life is a good thing. But there are an awful lot of arenas for finding help, including your family and friends, the community, uh, things in the community that you relate to, churches or social hangouts. Getting help from other human beings is an important process. The idea that the only way to get help as a human being is to sign up for 30-day or 60-day imprisonment and rehab is completely wrong. And of course, one form of help you can seek is counseling or coaching or therapy for problems that you think you have. And having a sensitive, open minded counselor, that's a valuable thing to have of any sort, no matter what their training is. But I virtually rule out the value of having somebody who says, well, I follow the 12 steps, because the 12 steps is a mind control system. And if somebody identifies that as their uh, therapeutic mode, what they're sort of saying is, I don't believe in general improvement. I don't believe in a lot of different paths to improvement. I believe that you have to sign on to these goofy 12 steps as the only way to go forward. And I don't feel you should make a contract with somebody or an organization that's based on that premise.
Yeah, especially with the evidence that's presented. And for a lot of people, they don't really understand. So if somebody, even themselves, experiencing the first step, they think is, pull some sort of intervention together. And then, I've always thought interventions to be kind of a bad idea. The way they're set up is that, you take everybody around you that you may have hurt or affected, pull them in front of you, and then let them all read off to you how shitty you've been to them. And then let them tell you how much they all love you. But then please get the fuck out of our lives and go away for 30 to 60 days Okay. I used to go, what? Wait a minute.
It's a funny process. I agree.
Yeah, I've found it. So, but that seems to be the first order, right? People and a family member or something, a son, daughter, they just go, all right, let's put them in rehab. The person does 30 days or 60 or 90, comes out of the rehab and doesn't do well. And then right, the family members, they kind of look like, hey, you failed at rehab. We spent all the big money, right? We did the right things. This is on you now. And they kind of turn their back then in a way.
Well, I mean, let's say something sympathetic. Why do people do that? It's because they've lost the sequence or the ability to communicate in an intimate way with people or family other than this highly crazed and artificial method. I mean, maybe a lot of us have a problem of saying to a person separately, I love you. I care about you. Here's a problem I'm having with you right now. Um, you're allowed to communicate with people, but it's communicating with them as a pathway of like pulling a trap door and dropping them into, like a magic bullet into heaven or hell or rehab. That's not a legitimate human communication.
Yeah, it rarely even seems rational, and we continue to repeat it. They pour billions of more dollars into mental health politically because it sounds good that they do this, and they continue to dump all that money in such a broken system. I mean, that really struggles to actually help people.
Well, the problem we have, and the 12 steps is not the cutting edge now. The cutting edge now is medical treatment for addiction,
Right.
apropos of the American Society of Addiction Medicine or the American Board of Addiction Medicine and medicine assisted treatment. Um, I should say that fundamentally, we're never going to improve our society's ability to come to grips with addiction because we have wholesalely shifted the resources from helping human beings as individuals, as a society, as a community, to treating them for addiction. Let's take the outer reaches of insanity. What if you take, we're aware, although we deny, that there are centers of addiction in Appalachian, West Virginia, in inner city Baltimore. Let's let's do a reductio ad absurdum. You take a person in that environment and you remove them for a week, a month, 2 months, 6 months, and say, we're going to make your lives better by going through the 12 steps or by giving you uh, methadone or buprenorphine. And then we're going to put you exactly back in that same environment with exactly the same influences, with exactly the same failure of housing, with exactly the same lack of training and job opportunity. Get better. And we've shifted the ideas. Even people that don't think addiction is a disease now believe that we really operate out of a disease treatment mode, which is to say, well, let's extricate the person from their lives, do something to them, then throw them back into their lot in life, and let's see if they'll get better. So
Yeah.
we're on an irreducible track to nowhere, because even some of the best people who feel, well, our drug war's crazy, and most of what Donald Trump said is crazy, say what we need to do is invest millions and hundreds of millions and billions more in treatment. We're already the most addiction treated society in the world, with results that we witness all the time around us, just this this asymptotically increasing uh, drug deaths, and we just don't know what to do about it. Except, why don't we do more of the same? Why don't we take more people, take them away from their lives, treat them, and forget about their lives, which is the source of their addiction in the first place?
Yeah, the environment is so looked over. That was my issue working within the treatment facilities was that same idea. And that what I referenced earlier of chemical incarceration was an idea that being affected by a chemical in some way leads to incarceration on some level, whether it's either a disability defined as a disease, in and out of rehab. Sometimes that actually leads to actual incarceration. And the idea that we try to get others off of certain chemicals and then put them on other chemicals and then define them as being labeled as this for life, and the chemicals then stick for life. So that's kind of the reference of the chemical incarceration approach to treatment.
I get what you're saying by chemical incarceration. I mean, what can I tell you? I know some of the people closest to me have taken medications. I'm not for or against that, but it's not a cure for addiction. It's not a cure for anything. The goal of living life unencumbered by, fundamental chemical assistance. I mean, chemical assistance now and again, what the heck, we all can do it, uh, is to me a denial of the very essence of life. I mean, it's not Zen Buddhism to say, well, I just don't have a way of dealing with life without being medicated by any form of medication, something you get at the pharmacist or something you provide on your own. And I'm against it. And to say that we're going to resubstitute one form of medication for another is simply not an answer to the fundamental issues of why as an individual or as a society, we fail to enable people to connect directly to life and other human beings. And that's the fundamental question that we're not dealing with. And in any therapy situation or any drug policy situation, we have to ask the question, are we enhancing this individual's respect for themselves and their ability to cope with life? And are we enhancing the strength of the communities that they live in? Those are the questions that we need to ask. If we don't ask those questions and if we can't answer them in the affirmative, then we're not only not doing anything, we're actually digging a deeper hole for ourselves.
Yeah, we brushed over the definition being a disease linked to addiction. So to come right out with it, where are we in the research? Are we any further about addiction being a disease or not? What are both sides saying? And frankly, after this little chat in the beginning, is it important? And what's the importance of diagnosing it in that method?
Well, the irony is everybody says, well, everybody knows addiction is a disease. And in fact, even the most disease-oriented elements, DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual that most professionals in the United States work with, virtually all, I should say, doesn't use the word addiction, doesn't use the word dependence, doesn't use the word disease. And so that's one thing it doesn't do. Secondly, it's a harm reduction document. It doesn't claim that using a drug again creates any kind of diagnosis. Only problems create a diagnosis. It's a problem-linked based diagnostic tool. And then the third amazing thing about DSM-5, not that I'm committed to it, when I said it doesn't use the word addiction, that's not correct. It doesn't use the word addiction with regard to any substance. It does use the word addiction with regards to a single human activity. In the whole spectrum of life, DSM-5 and their crazy wisdom can be addictive. So we're rearranging the fragments of the broken glass, trying to piece it together. And I'll jump to the end and tell you what the right answer is. Any engaging involvement has the potential to be addictive if it distracts and dissociates you from your life to a point where you become incapable of dealing directly with life and resort and relate to life strictly through that involvement, no matter what that involvement is, so that it provides your fundamental human rewards in life, whether it's gambling or sex or shopping or eating or drinking or drug use or prescription drug use. Those are what are addictions. They're not drug-based. No drug causes or prevents or solves addiction. It's an existential relationship you have to an activity and an existential relationship that you have to life. And we sort of almost realized that. I wrote Love and Addiction in 1975, and in 2013, DSM-5 labeled no drugs addictive and only gambling. They're still trying to rearrange the pieces into a new whole. They've broken the vase, but they haven't put it back together again. And the answer is addiction is the nature of a relationship you have to some engaging involvement. And it doesn't matter what that involvement is, a diagnosis of being addicted or not.
Yeah, where did the concept of treatment, a inpatient treatment, a 30-day, 60-day, where did this concept first begin? Where did it come from that this became the approach to someone dealing with an addiction?
Well, that's a pretty complicated question. I don't know if I care to spend that much time on it. You might say, well, where did 12 Steps become the American Bible? That's a long story by itself. And then rehab is a way of commercializing AA and the 12-step approach. The whole concept, I wrote a book called Diseasing America, the whole concept of trying to package problems, medical conditions that we can treat, it's a very American way of doing things. And Americans are happy when they can say, oh, your problem is a disease, we have a treatment for it. Americans love that. And it marks a tendency worldwide, but fundamentally American, to say we've gotten farther and farther away from imagining an individual functioning within a community or a culture or society and working and relying on that society to make their lives worthwhile, and saying, well, people go through life with a bunch of problems and traumas, and our job is to treat them away from those problems. It's a fundamentally, it's turned on in America, and that it's our nature to spread worldwide. It has nothing to do with solving the problems. There's no sign whatsoever in any area of mental health that we're improving our mental health, that we're reducing any form of mental illness or mental disorder. We're not reducing ADHD, bipolar, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. We're increasing all of those things. And all that does is feed into our tendency to label people and then to treat them. And in a way that makes us happy. We're addicted to that approach. But by any fundamental measure of mental health, and obviously by any fundamental measure of chemical health, to use Bob Mascala's term, starting with not dying from using substances, we're failing. We're failing miserably. We're failing at an accelerated pace. And all that we know how to do is to do more of what's caused that failure in the first place.
The insanity of the treatment itself, as we watch it rise, anxiety, I think it's rising significantly in kids too. I have a 17-year-old that experienced it a little bit. As no one seems to be saying it's the environment possibly, right, that we're immersed in, because it doesn't have a huge divide when it comes to people that live in the United States about who it affects.
Well, the New York Times had an article last month saying the New York Times is the announcer of epidemics of mental disorders. And it's funny that when you label college anxiety levels, anxiety is a mental disorder, have just risen asymptotically to levels that people didn't think were possible. And what do we do about that? We have no way of thinking about how to deal with it. What we need to think about is the environment. That's true. I mean, what about colleges so anxiety producing for people? And the other component is what are we doing in terms of producing children to allow them to lead lives that aren't riddled by mental disorders? By the way, in between talking with you, what I'm trying to do is to arrange a trip to Idaho with my grandson. Last August, I went both to Burlington, Vermont, where I hung out with Zach Rhodes, and then I went for a week to Boise, Idaho, with my grandson to hang out with my old friend Larry, who I've known 50 or so years, where, you know, he rode horses and he didn't hunt. Check that. He fished, where he ran around the woods with other kids. He did all of the things that are denied him anywhere else. He talked with adults. He built a stool for himself with Larry. He did all of those fundamental relationship things with his environment, with tools, with his skill level, with interpersonal things. And I mean, I'm only a tangential influence in my grandson's life, but it's a way of opening. It was my little educational experience for opening him to the world and to his abilities and to his way of dealing with people and things that I hope will have a lasting beneficial impact for him.
Yeah, they do. That kind of leads into the question I was going to ask about what are they finding in the research as far as the environmental influence as being the direct or indirect cause for the rise of.
Well, we have we only count things that say that we've found a gene or a biological sequence that's related to addiction or mental illness. In fact, we've disproven that. There's no longer a search for a gene for addiction or any individual mental illness. They're only looking now for small global components in general mental disorders. Genetics research, the completion of the Human Genome Project, has alerted us to the fact that there aren't genes for things that are corresponding to human behavior and feelings. That doesn't exist. It's a seething mass of influential material interacting with itself and with the environment. We have long histories of information about how different environments impact people. Of course, everybody knows trauma is bad for people. We have long volumes of research showing that poverty, that lack of opportunity, that lower social economic options create more problems. And that's being written out now as though it's a big science experiment in looking at deaths by addiction, deaths by drug use in West Virginia, where it's rampant and massive. So we have a scientific basis, a research basis for declaring and knowing this. And now we have the real world manifestations of these things, but we've lost any ability or concern for trying to remedy them at that level. And we search continuously for some kind of medical, biological, medicine-based cure for these things that are rearing their ugly heads and refusing to go back into their cages, even though we have a strong supposition of what's causing them.
Yeah, the genetic influence, that's all I would hear about in the treatment facilities I worked in. It would talk about predispositions and talking about, well, it's genetic and here's your family history. There was so much influence and a push in that they forgot, almost overlooked the influence of the actual environment, of trauma, social disconnection, other issues that play into it, poverty, as you mentioned, and so many other things.
Well, not only are they incapable of looking at that, but even trauma therapy itself. Martin Seligman has that positive psychology program at Penn, and what they're emphasizing is what we've always known to be true. Recalling the past as a therapeutic tool, identifying trauma or linking our problems to sort of some irreversible genetic link, are recipes for disaster. Human beings progress, expand, and improve based on their ability to formulate new ways of dealing with their environments. That's how it works. And instead, it's as though we're reversing what we know to be the most what we call cognitive behavior therapy, to be the most effective way of dealing with problems, by convincing people that their problems are unchangeable, that they're totally anchored in their biology or their past, even though that's not true, because we know people get over addictions and change all the time, but in a way that demoralizes them so they're incapable of making the progress that they could possibly or optimally make. We've created a modern anti-miracle. We've created a therapeutic environment and state and public health system which convinces people to do the reverse of what's the most likely to bring them happiness and mental health.
Yeah, as the first treatment would be isolation, right? Pulling you away from your social contacts and putting you in the rehab. The exact opposite of what is research really showing that, I guess, I should ask
Well,
you.
as I began this by talking about, I have a program that's online, involves both, online exercises and talking with the counselor. The best data show that trying to learn to cope with your environment in vitro is the most successful way of trying to improve your life. What are you going to do with an 8-year-old or a 12-year-old or an 18-year-old or a 24-year-old or a 44-year-old? You're going to say, well, your life isn't working. Why don't we take you away from that life and tell you some things, most of it nonsense, and then re-immerse you in that life, but give you no skills or practice in dealing with the people in the life that you are going to have to live the minute we stop doing therapy for you. It's nonsensical on the face of it.
Yeah, to remove someone from an environment and then it put them right back in the middle, as you talked about in the beginning, is I think the most influential, as well as what you're saying with the research coming out, right? Because you would hear even in the treatment hallways, if you will, that hey, this is genetic. You know, they may find the gene for depression and be able to remove that,
They'll never
etc.
find it for gene for depression. They've proven there's no such gene. Even the Association of Biological Psychiatrists has said there is no gene for depression. There is no gene for depression. No gene for depression will ever be found. So strike that from your vocabulary, Adam. I don't want to hear you
Well,
say that again.
well, my point was with that being removed, now they've seemed to move to the neuroscience investigation, the brain sense. And have we come any further in the research of being able to prove any mental disorder, be that addiction or anything else, with brain scans or brain operation or functioning?
No human being in the United States of America or the world is diagnosed for any mental disorder by a brain scan. No human being is diagnosed for addiction, depression, anxiety, or bipolar by a brain scan. Everybody is diagnosed by manifested behavior and ability or disability to function. The two, I don't want to, DSM 5 is a crazy document. It's a document in transition, but it argues no matter what your behavior is, no matter what symptoms you have, you don't belong in here if you lack two things. If you lack impairment and if you lack distress. If you're able to live life without being impaired or distressed, then it doesn't matter if you take cocaine. It doesn't matter what we measure to be the responses you have to cocaine in your brain. That's not how we decide it. If you're able to function successfully in a way that's satisfactory to you, you don't belong in DSM 5. And no brain scan tells you that. How do you know a person's impaired? We know. They're not functioning well. They're not getting along with people. They're getting arrested. They're having health problems. Able to keep a job. None of those things is measurable in the brain. None of them. And how do you learn if a person's distressed? Well, you ask them, well, how are you feeling? And again, you observe how they're behaving, and then you ask people close to them. So we've proven that there's no successful biological brain component that corresponds to what we consider to be what are the clinical signs of mental disorders. We know that. And nobody in the world believes that. No human, not even Nora Volkow would say, we have a person who takes cocaine, but they're dealing successfully. Their family doesn't seem to worry about it. They seem to be okay. But we found the brain scan that says they're a cocaine addict. That doesn't exist. By the way, here's a little anecdote that always fascinated me. The former president of the United States, Joe Biden, introduced a bill recognizing addiction as a disease just before he became vice president. Joe Biden had a son who has three daughters, who had a good job, who was in the Naval Reserve, and he tested positive for cocaine. So they kicked him out of the Naval Reserves. What happened then? I don't know what happened then. I don't think he went to rehab. I don't think his wife divorced him. I don't think he did. I don't think he lost his job. I think we uncovered a human being who was measured biologically to be using a substance that had no measurable, observable impact on his life, and that's called normal life. Except we refuse to recognize that. Even DPA, my great friend Tony Newman said, Mr. Vice President, don't you recognize now the problems that other human beings are having? As though the fact that a human being tested positive for cocaine was ipso facto proof that he had a mental disorder. That was from somebody from the DPA wrote that.
Jesus.
When in fact, what it was proof is that drugs per se, measuring the effects of drugs per se, sheds no light whatsoever on a person's successful ability to deal with life and with themselves.
Yeah, Dr. Carl Hardy even speaks about it. I think he uses the numbers, about 15% of people that we actually see on shows like Intervention or Think About through the rehabs are really is the percentage of people truly affected by the use, where they're 85%, a large percentage of people are daily users or use socially or how they want to, and they function properly with no heavy biological issues or behavioral, family, or job issues.
Well, Carl Hart is the guy. I would say his point of view is just about the closest to mine. I love to hear when I'm in the audience and he says, he might not say that lately, but he used to say, Stanton Peele showed me the way towards thinking this way. I understand writing a book about more or less how to use drugs normally. Now, that's going to be a daring book. I would
Yeah.
say, in general, people didn't understand or care about. Carl wrote a book that talked about his own inner city experience in Miami and how he got to be head of the Department of Psychology at Columbia. That's a story Americans love. Who doesn't love that story?
Yeah, the
And
high
along the
price.
way, what's that?
Yeah, the high price, I think, was the
The
name of
high
it.
price. And along the way, he says nothing about this story. My story, the story about Miami, has nothing to do with drugs. Um, Drugs are irrelevant to this equation. The problems in Miami, the inner city of Miami that I grew up in, they pre-existed before the crack cocaine epidemic, and they outlasted the crack cocaine epidemic. They're unrelated, those two sets of problems. The sets of problems that we need to deal with are the individual and social problems that go along with misuse of drugs. And I agree 100% with that. That's the problem. And mislabeling, what I'm going to say now is something that could come out of Carl Hart's mouth. Mislabeling as a chemical problem, what is in fact a social or psychological problem, is just a cultural excuse for not dealing with that problem.
Well, that is fire. And true, it seems to be that it sounds good, right? We, like you said, we're in love with the, pill idea, right? I mean, look at weight loss, right? Or everything else that it's take the magic pill for. We're in love with that idea of what's wrong with me, give me the fix, I take it and move on.
You used to have a drug problem, right, Adam?
Yeah, you could call it that, but I kept it
And
masked, right?
I also remember you quit smoking, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
And how did you quit smoking?
Changed behavior while changing beliefs, implementing new routines habitually.
You look like you're reasonably healthy. How are you feeling these days?
Feel pretty good. Feel pretty good.
You have a child, don't you?
I do. She's 17.
Oh, are you still married to his mother?
To her mother, no, I am not.
No. How is she doing in life?
She is awesome. She's a senior in high school, but actually in college. So she'll be graduating already a sophomore in college, committed to a state
I'm going to
university.
guess some things. I don't know your daughter, and I'm guessing she doesn't smoke cigarettes.
No, no,
So she's ahead of you on that. You were probably at that age smoking cigarettes.
no. I was still playing football. That didn't kick in until the drug dealing started.
Okay. Does she drink alcohol?
Nope.
Zero alcohol consumption.
Yes, sir. As far as I know.
You didn't. You never. Do you drink alcohol?
I do.
You never shared alcohol with your daughter.
No, maybe a sip of wine on a New Year or something.
Well, that's a little bit. Um, there's an actress. What's her name? I'm so bad with actresses' names. Is her name Milas Kundras? Is that a famous actress's name?
You're on your own there, Stan. I
There
did
is
not
just. She
follow.
was just in People magazine. They almost arrested her. She said, as a part of her rituals, she gives. I think her daughter was 3. She gives her daughter 3 sips of wine. I said, my own daughter, Anna Peele, who's 29, who does drink wine, and to whom I introduced. I had a Romanian wife. My wife was Romanian bred. We gave our daughter wine. We have 3 children, none of whom's an alcoholic. Um, and Milas Kundras, geez, I wish I had that name exactly right. I looked her up. She's a Ukrainian Jew. And Jews have a custom of, during the high holidays, giving on Friday nights, giving children sips of wine. Now, obviously, in fact, they put wine on the lips of a newborn. That's the first prayer they say at at a circumcision ceremony. Um, so wine is a normal part of people's lives. You know, obviously, when you give a 6-year-old or a 9-year-old a sip of wine over Passover, that's different than you might give them a half a glass of wine mixed with water when they were 12. It's not for me to say what's the right way to do this, but wine is considered a normal part of human beings' lives. It's not considered a sin or a way of ruining yourself. It's a whole interesting conception. And so we need to develop that form of consciousness of, again, using Bob Mescal's term, chemical health, and we're going to have to apply it more broadly. And the reason we're going to have to apply it more broadly is because it's kind of hard now to avoid being exposed to drugs. And by that, I mean the entire range of drugs, besides anything painkillers. I mean, painkiller. Besides marijuana, marijuana is legal in an, for a third of the American population now that California's jumped in. We give children are more and more often on antidepressants. You know, something like 14% of kids are now on antidepressants. We give children pretty powerful drug now in increasing amounts for bipolar disorder. You can't live a life in the 21st century without having some sensible way of responding to drugs and chemical experiences. You have to know how to do that because you're not going to get through this lifetime without that kind of exposure. And I don't know what Carl's book's like. He hasn't shared it with me, but I think that's going to be the first salvo in saying that dealing with chemicals is a fundamental skill required in the 21st century.
Mm.
So, I don't know if you're having Passover dinner with your, I think Passover's, that's in the spring with your daughter. But, perhaps share some wine with her over Passover, or Easter, as the case may be. You may recall the Last Supper, they served wine, and that was the Passover dinner, Not
Yeah,
that I'm recommending.
oh, it's not a whole controversial topic. I took a different approach actually as she was in probably about 10. I rather than try this say no Nancy Reagan approach or this they don't exist bullshit. I went with education. I mean, I went as far as literally going, this is what it is. Here's how it works. I even showing here, this is what it looks like. This is what it can do. All of the curiosity just kind of killed with competence. And she used to come home sometimes from school and laugh about how she'd overhear a group of people talking about how they were going to grow marijuana or do drugs like this. And it's all made like this. And that education really kind of took a lot of curiosity, I think, away from her for experiment at a younger age. But and they struggle, Stanton, in most of the school districts from Orange County all over. They struggle to find a good education program. And it's pretty wild because they let almost anybody, if you organize some sort of program of drug education, they're like, come in. There's no uniform approach of how to educate. It's up in the air even about, what we
And
tell
there's
our
nothing
kids about.
about like, is this increasing their ability to cope with life and to understand themselves and to deal with life? Those are the fundamental issues. And showing children respect for themselves and their ability to deal with things. Um, I'm the opposite of a don't say no. I don't say no to anything to children.
Yeah.
People often kind of notice that about me. I mean, the greatest thing for me was when my daughter-in-law allowed me to take my grandson first to Vermont with Zach and then to Idaho, because people know that about me. I mean, I don't give them lectures about not doing or doing anything. I expose them to positive opportunities in life that make them feel better about themselves and to develop skills and to feel good about their capacity to cope with life. That's the answer, my best answer to mental health. So, well, Larry used to brew his own beer. He doesn't anymore. But in the morning in Idaho, we get up in the morning. Larry has good cigars, and he has his homebrew beer. We do yoga, and then we have a half a cigar and a beer, and then we go out and fish or hike. And then at night when we come home, and we finish the beer. Now, we didn't give my grandson any cigar or beer. He's 9. He never asked for any. But on the other hand, we communicated to him that this is a normal part of our lives. It's part of how we relate to the world. It's something that should be incorporated into a positive life experience. And then we're going to let him, well, he's not my son and he's not Larry's son. About how he's going to deal with these things in his own life.
Yeah, I think the epidemic of the opiate or whatever we call it is it's bringing light to the idea that they've made the drug the enemy, right? Like that's helped push on the war on drugs, et cetera, which has incarcerated so many, kills others. But we seem to overstep. Like we're almost going. It must be a biological thing. It must be genes. Not that. It must be in the brain. It's got to be there. So then we can economically develop treatments for it that are linked to pharmacology. It seems to be that that's the only approach we want to determine, or it can
well,
be.
when I really admire many. I admire one of the announcers on MSNBC, and then he interviewed somebody, a woman. There's a new program called Heroin, with an E in parenthesis, and it's about 3 women in West Virginia who are working to stave off the heroin death. It's not overdose, not an accurate term, since very few people die of heroin.
It's a
They're
mixture.
dying of combinations of drugs. Heroin is now mixed with tranquilizer and, of course, with fentanyl. Um, and then, he talked about the horrors, and 80%, the woman said, of the people that die, they deal daily. This was the fire chief he interviewed. And they die daily of overdose in this county in West Virginia. 80%, over 80% of them started with painkillers. And what's that tell us? I mean, the thing I'd like to ask the interviewer is, tell me, have you ever taken painkillers? By the way, this very minute, I just stopped taking painkillers. I'm 71 because I had a bone spur. That's pretty painful when they remove it. Well, I haven't stopped taking painkillers, but I cut it back to I had one this morning because I took a long walk. People take painkillers. Painkillers are a modern medical advance. If his logic is, well, if you take painkillers, and that's sort of the logic they're selling, well, nobody can manage that. Next thing you're taking heroin, next thing you're dying. Every step in that process is inaccurate. People tend to take painkillers in a healthy way when they're in pain. If you kind of give them guidance along those lines and regulate their access to it, they'll take painkillers in a proper fashion. By the way, Zach and I are interviewing a guy named Dirk. I just came back in September. I gave a lecture at a conference in Lisbon. He researches drug consumption sites in Frankfurt, Germany. And here's the concept. Human beings use these drugs. And there hasn't been a single death by overdose of narcotics in a drug consumption room in Frankfurt. If you give people guidance, and some people need to actually, and of course, you guarantee that the drugs you test on are pure, virtually nobody is going to die of any drug, including painkillers and heroin. If you make sure they're actually taking the drug that they think they're taking, and if you give them some structure to take it in some regulated basis, they won't die. And right now, we're having a death epidemic that we just can't put our hands around. No matter how many things we've tried, no matter how much naltrexone or Narcan we've introduced, no matter how much methadone, we can't turn the corner on drug, heroin, and painkiller and other deaths. We're going in exactly the wrong direction. Aside from giving people a positive reason to live, we have to allow people to use drugs in regulated ways, in regulated settings, according to prescriptions or in drug regulation, drug testing, or drug consumption sites. And then they'll stop dying. That's the answer. There's nothing about the drug in itself that's killing people. It's our whole unstructured, negativistic, attacking way of not coming to grips with it that's killing people.
It's that the 15% we focus on. I think it's what is it, 122 something people a day. And you pointed out the an important part where most people believe it's just straight either opiate of some kind or painkiller addiction, when really truly the ODs or the deaths are coming from the mixture of mixing the two of it unregulated, not knowing what they buy or taking.
Right. I mean, there are three things you can do. You can give people drugs, you can give them a place to take drugs safely, or you can test their drugs for them. All of those things are ways of assisting people to take drugs. Let's just say we're not about to do that in America. Although there are no drug consumption sites in America, Seattle County, whatever county Seattle's in, has just passed a law to set them up. It's now becoming virtually national policy in Canada. It's policy in many countries now in Western Europe to assist people to take drugs in a way that allows them not to die. Because right now it's not even clear that people have been using less painkillers in recent years. It's also not clear that we have a heroin addiction epidemic. What we have is a opioid death epidemic. We don't seem to be able to get an increasing number of people use substances in a way that makes it more likely that they're going to die, even though we're not clear that they're using more of any of the supposedly operative heroin or painkiller or Demerol or drugs per se. It's their method of administering them, their combinations of drug use in their lives that are leading to this epidemic of deaths. So that we've gone beyond trying to deal with addiction or drugs. Now we're just trying to deal with drug fatalities. And we're going about that entirely the wrong way by making it harder and harder for people to get painkillers, which of course drives them to use street drugs in the first place.
Yeah, I mean we're fighting such a concrete cognitive dissonance about what drugs mean, about how it defines the person. I mean, so much emphasis over the years on what a drug is, or what a person that uses a drug even is, or means. I mean, I remember seventh grade watching Say No videos, and from marijuana to alcohol, every person using, they would depict as this just ragged, beat up, devilish character, and I remember that. I'm like, say no, but I do remember the first time I did smoke marijuana, and I went, I don't want to kill anybody or, sell my shoes. I'm like,
how old were you?
I was probably 14, 15, maybe something like that. And
would you say you were a successful marijuana user? What's your view of that?
I would say I kind of was for a while, I guess. But, for me, I don't know, it felt good in the sense it was a stimulating response. So for me,
what drugs did you get hung up on yourself?
For me, it all came with the nightclub scene I was in after. Well, I was selling drugs for a long time before the nightclubs, but it would be a rotation. It would be cocaine sometimes, and ecstasy was big then. I was DJing then, so it'd be 2 or 3 days, rolling as we'd call it. 2 or 3 days, maybe sleep one night, and then the weekend would come at the club, and a little bit of alcohol and coke to run you over the weekend, and sleep sometime on Sunday.
You're a perfect example. You can't even use the word addiction when you're using different drugs. You don't get addicted to, well, sometimes I use alcohol, sometimes I use cocaine, sometimes I use ecstasy. That's not addiction. A better term might be, well, I don't know your life story, so a better description of what we often find is the word chaotic drug use. I would use the word self-destructive drug use. I mean, there are people who you want to say, I don't know, do you think that's good for you? That's just like a question you ask people. And for some people, the answer to that question is, I don't care. And then when the answer to that question is, I don't care, Houston, we have a problem. But the word addiction doesn't apply when you're rotating crops like you're describing from one drug to the other.
Look at the environment, Stanton. The environment itself.
It's the human being dealing with life that we're focusing on. Saying, well, okay, we're going to eliminate ecstasy from your menu, in no way addresses what was happening to you.
Yeah, it was environmental. Stan, my environment, brother, was that of selling drugs, doing drugs, party, nightclub. So the environment itself brought on not only my income and my way of paying bills and staying alive, it was part of the social connection that I was in. It was just kind of what you did. And the minute I removed myself from that environment and changed my behavior and interaction, it wasn't about it being a disease or an addiction or entrapment.
Would you say your lifestyle is positive now? I mean, you're
Yeah.
trying to make a positive impact in society, on your daughter, on your own life, and on your community. Is that a fair description now?
Yeah. As positive as my subjective notion can call it. Yeah.
God bless you. I mean, you've changed. It's your environment's changed. I mean, it's sort of like you were fighting a cover-up action. Trying to get through the weekend, trying to feel okay about yourself, trying to have some friends. Now you're trying to make a decent effort to have a positive life, make a positive contribution to society, to your family, to the people you know. You don't have to be Jesus Christ or Mahatma Gandhi. You probably don't even litter anymore. So,
I don't.
uh,
I don't.
good work. You're just trying to do. It's not even you're trying to be a saint. You're
I'm just trying
trying
to
to
get
have
into
a
heaven,
reasonably
Stan.
positive impact on human beings that you deal with, including yourself. It ain't much, but let's go with that as a way. Once you get people trying to do that, to have a positive, then they're going to hurt. They're going to hurt themselves less. Right now, I bet it would be. It's just impossible for you to imagine yourself, even though you drink alcohol. It's just impossible for you to imagine yourself being addicted. You've got some responsibilities. You've got a certain positive image in the community. You've got a teenage daughter. It would be impossible for you to return to anything like your chaotic drug use. Your life has ruled that out for you. And, not to make, as I said, a saint out of you, it's a somewhat normal progression that you've made. And it also combines some kind of self awareness where you've tried to develop some, you had positive values all along, but where you're trying to realize your positive goals in life.
Yeah, you meet enough bad guys, Stan, you realize you're not one. When you really meet evil,
You're
mean mother.
okay, Adam, and All right, Adam. I think we've covered the entire range of topics that anybody could be concerned about with addiction. I don't want to, I want your listeners to go out and do something positive, like pick up some litter. You know,
Well,
um,
before we jump off, what do we do? Right, let's forget the budgets or anything else. Right, you and I are have a moment of dictatorship to implement what we do. What's our plan, Stan? What are the first things we do to maybe even change anything?
well, the first thing we have to do is to, on the broadest scale, we have to try and make living life, a more positive experience. Ethan Nadelman and others say, why are people so interested in pain relievers? What the hell's going on? Why are so many people in so much pain? If you can't go to West Virginia and say, we're going to create a life in a community that you want to live, or inner city Baltimore, then, we're going to have we're never going to be able to answer the question of why are people misusing drugs and hurting themselves. And that's a big question. And the question is American society prepared and able to help people create a more positive life experience for themselves? I don't know the answer. I don't know that we're going to be able to do that. But if I were a dictator, I would say, well, we're going to have to, I'd raise taxes. I'd say, well, we're going to have to spend more money and try and get people more engaged in positive activities. We're going to have to interact with them more. We're going to have to cut down the barriers between, the people who run the country and live where I don't live in such a fancy neighborhood now. I used to live in Park Slope, where the mayor of New York lived. We're going to have fewer barriers between those neighborhoods and not even inner city Baltimore and West Virginia. There are plenty of areas in New York where those barriers exist. So that's on the global side of things. On the other side of things, you know, vilifying drugs does no good. Making it harder and harder for people to get. I mean, we have doctors, I feel, are reasonably good at determining when a person needs a painkiller. I don't even know if I should tell this story, but I was with an older friend when I had my bone uh, uh, spur removed from my foot. my older friend said, "What about stout?" I looked at her, stout meaning, I think, beer. I looked at her like she was crazy. And the doctor said, "Well, just remember that alcohol multiplies the effects of painkillers." And that's all he said. I guess he figured since I was 71 years old, I could take that information and deal with it. You know what I mean? Don't
Yeah.
drink a bunch of beers and take a bunch of painkillers,
Oh yeah.
which I already knew. Um, and then he relied on me to make a sensible decision. And he gave me a prescription for as much Percocet as I wanted because he knew that I wasn't interested in taking Percocet. I was interested in walking again. And we have to take that kind of a respectful approach of providing people with information. Um, God bless them. I'm not a big fan of medicine, but allowing doctors who are dealing with patients to decide with the patient what's the appropriate amount of a painkiller to give them. And we should it's not that we're doing bad at that. People don't die from getting painkillers from their doctors. They die from not getting painkillers from doctors, going out in the street and picking up whatever they can on the street without any kind of prescription. And we should take that kind of a regulated, what's an expert, what's a health practitioner who cares about you, telling you, who knows you, and we can apply that to every drug. As I said, Zach and I are going to talk with a man who's involved in the Frankfurt, Germany drug consumption scene. We're going to talk about creating an environment where people can take drugs of any kind in a way that's not self-destructive and that allows them a positive way of interacting with life. So that's going from the broadest view of society. We have to make it more worthwhile and fulfilling for people, to the narrowest question, well, how do people take drugs? We have to give them information. And of course, we're not telling anybody to take drugs. Plenty of people are making that decision on their own without us telling them anything. And then we're going to say, well, we want to make that as safe an experience as possible, even a positive experience if possible. Perhaps you've heard of the president of the United States is named Donald Trump.
Yeah,
And in the
unfortunately.
course of his new drug strategy, which is nothing, he said, well, we've got to convince people never to take drugs. I don't know if we've ever heard that approach before, but I feel faintly that I have. And he mentions his brother was an alcoholic, and so he never consumed alcohol in his life. And I can't believe it, all of the liberal commentators on MSNBC said, well, that was really personal. That was really great. But a lot of people drink alcohol and a lot of people enjoy it. Yeah, you and I being two of them. Um, I live in Brooklyn. In Brooklyn, every corner, or, every neighborhood has a couple of beer pubs, and they're starting to brew special. They're brewing specialty beers and specialty distilled spirits now. We're not going to do away with alcohol. We tried that, didn't work well. What we have to do is to cultivate human beings' ability, because they have a good life and because they appreciate that substances have benefits and costs, to get them to reflect on what's positive about a substance, toasting a birth or a wedding, or having a shot with a good friend on a weekend, or having a beer or two after work with people that you work with. That's a reasonable human dynamic that should be appreciated and respected and encouraged with guidelines and information. So, I'm looking forward to Carl's book when it comes out as being one step towards normalizing and respecting human beings and their substance use.
Yeah, the acceptance. And maybe one more question with you. What do you say to the person, or what do we do about the idea that those that think that anyone is attached to some sort of substance, if you will, therefore has some sort of weakness or dependence on this thing in order to operate?
Well, I mean, I believe in addiction, and I believe there are people who are hurting themselves through drug use. Um, and when I do therapy and I have a program, and I don't tell them they're hurting themselves. We ask questions. I don't diagnose anybody. I say, well, you tell me what the impact of your substance use is. Um, you tell me if you're happy with the impact of the substance in your life. And that's where we begin the therapeutic endeavor. If they say, well, not 100%, and I say, well, I don't know if I'm going to make it 100%, but let's work in that direction. What's going to make you happier about the way you use substances? And By the way, I have an odd therapeutic technique. If I know people who are drinking too much, I don't often say to them, you got to stop drinking. Here's what I say to them. I have the strangest approach I know. I say, I'm not sure if I like the way that you drink, but I'm going to tell you something. If you get to a point where you have to say about yourself, I'm going to have to quit drinking alcohol altogether, I'm going to stop dealing with you entirely. Sorry. So if you want to keep me as a friend, maybe that's not of any interest to you. You need to learn how to regulate your use of this substance now to continue to have me as a friend, because I'm not going to accept, crazy behavior, and I'm not going to accept you quitting ever using alcohol at all. Neither of those is going to work for me. So, that's just one word from this isn't a therapy technique. If you want to quit drinking, it's okay with me in therapy. But as me as a human being, as somebody that you're going to hang out with, you better know how to use the substance you're using in a positive, constructive way. You better be in control of yourself, or, it's not going to work for us as friends.
Yeah, the undemonizing of the drugs themselves, the education, the possible legalization and openness to it. And if somebody does need help, easy, full access to the full menu of what's open and effective, not what's guaranteed when you have to step in line at Medicare or something like that. Seems to be
Good
the real.
summary.
Yeah, that's kind of the approach that I see. And if for me,
And I'd extend it one iota going in the direction that Carl's going into. Letting people know what healthy substance use looks like, educating them about positive substance use, including giving young people information on which to make positive substance use decisions. That's the next frontier. And I see Carl's book as being an opening salvo in that direction.
Yeah, it is hard. And for anybody listening or parents out there, I mean, I put it on anyone to help break that stigma and educate your kids. Don't hold them back and tell them lies about what is or what isn't. And talk about genetic as being the issue and how your father and grandfather was, so you are. And possibly even entertain the idea that if you're saying, I'm going to quit using anything all the time forever, you may be entertaining an irrational concept.
Excellent. Hey, what's your daughter? What's she going to major in? Do you know, or she decided?
She wants to be a plastic surgeon, and
Wow.
that's where she's headed. But she's got a whole plan laid out. She does this little side business she's doing on social media. She goes to 6,000 concerts a month and goes in as media and does some documentation and photography,
Now,
etc.
to what do you attribute her skill level and positive aspirations? So what, let's give a little kudo to you and her mother for having done something reasonably right here.
Oh, I think I had somewhat to do with it. Her mother's been a great influence on her and continues to be. And it was I don't know. It's I think it has been. I think the environment, because the other half, the father stock she come from, is let's just say made some poor choices and is in need of a lot more help, and let her go a long time ago. But for me, it was kind of proof in the pudding that the right environmental influence can deter and do away with any genetic implication.
Did you? I'm going to guess that you showed her a lot of respect and gave her as much independence as you felt was appropriate. At whatever stage in her life was. You weren't the like, let's lock her in a crib kind of father.
Oh, man, I was in the beginning until it was so hard to walk through that as she got older. But no, the freedom was there. Her mom really kept it balanced by keeping her free. And for me, just being quietly there in case she needed me, and never got to a point to where I was creating a preacher's daughter, if you will. So the freedom was necessary. Sometimes I would get overprotective just because the asshole young boy I know I was and project that onto her life. But she it's been great. She's really been blessed with both sides and a lot of
Well, you
family.
sounds like it was a positive interaction and it improved you as a human being too.
Yeah, I would tell you, I can't say I've ever loved anything so unconditionally in my life.
Well, that's number one, Adam. That's before you start using parental techniques. Obviously, you've got to express that and feel that kind of love. So, good work, Adam. You've been making great progress. How old are you now?
36.
Oh, for
36.
God's sake, you've been through 5 lives already, and you're not even.
Uh,
You're about the same age, a little bit older maybe than Zach Rhodes. So I'm looking forward to the two of you carrying on my work and Carl Hart's work after we're gone. Although, you might have to wait another 50 or 60 years, but keep up the great work.
oh man, your environment, the way I think you look at it, you're going to be around a long time, man. And I know your work will live on forever. And if I can do anything to try to carry that on or point it out, I can promise I
Well,
certainly,
this is a great start, Adam. Thanks for giving me this chance.
anytime,
And
if you ever need the microphone for anything, you reach out and it's all yours.
good to talk. Bye bye now.
All right, Stan. See you, buddy. Sometimes I wrap it up and close it out before the podcast actually ends and reflect on it. But we're still hanging out watching the news with Dr. Stanton Peele. All right, y'all. Oh, I love it.